Good morning. Today I will be talking about a brief history of special education and how we got to where we are today in special education. So, children with disabilities were not always treated the way they are treated now in the school system. Um, Before the 1960s, education for children with disabilities looked very different than it does today. Children with special needs were routinely excluded from public education because many people thought that children with disabilities weren't able to be educated, even those with mild disabilities. So institutionalization was the recommended place for children with disabilities. Um, and families with children with special needs had few options to educate their children. So many children with even mild disabilities started to feel like a burden to their families and to society in general. And many parents and educators did not like this and started advocating for the rights of disabled children. Um, but many of their concerns weren't heard, and children continued to be excluded from public education until a landmark case that had nothing to do with children with disabilities. Let's look at that case. This case is Brown versus Board of Education. Um, Oliver Brown had sued his school district in Topeka, Kansas, because his daughter Linda had been denied access to the all-white school close to their home, and the the then 8-year-old was forced to take the bus to a school across town, and when she could have attended the school close to her home, except that it was an all-white school, and she wasn't allowed to attend that school. So her dad decided to challenge this. The Supreme Court ruling um, that had actually combined several cases, similar cases, was that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And the separate but equal clause established by Plessy versus Ferguson, nearly 60 years older, uh, was challenged legally. And this inspired parents and educators of children with special needs to advocate for their rights too. Um, and the culmination of these efforts was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This law pro provided grants and was originally intended to help underprivileged students. And in 1966, the grant added handicapped students to the list of students it intended to help. And this was a very important important time in special education history because the movement that special needs children deserved to have an equal education as their regular education peers was gaining more and more momentum and eventually making its way to the courts and to lawmakers. But the fight was far from over. Um, Many children were still excluded from receiving the education that they needed. In uh, Park versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, parents sued the state of Pennsylvania because their children were denied public education based on intellectual disability. So these children were denied a public education because of their intellectual disability, and their parents did not agree with that, and so they decided to sue the state. Um, and this was a landmark case because it served as the basis for later laws regarding public education for children with disabilities. Um, the idea that children with disabilities deserve to be educated um, was gaining more and more momentum, and it was making its way to Congress, slowly but surely. And around the same time, there was another lawsuit on behalf of children with severe behavioral and emotional issues. So the fight was extended beyond children with physical disabilities. It was also beginning to include students with behavioral and emotional issues. This case was called Mills versus Board of Education of the District of Columbia, and the decision reiterated many of the Park case requirements. And this lawsuit established the free and appropriate education and zero reject principles that would decades later be used in the creation of IDEA laws. And based on these two cases, um, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 grew from the previous two cases. And the law's purpose was to ensure a free and appropriate public education for all children, regardless of disability. So, so the movement of educating uh, children with disabilities was finally paying off. All these efforts from parents and educators was finally paying off, so that these children with disabilities finally received the education they needed and deserved. And in 1990, this law was amended and renamed Individuals with Disabilities Act, and it was amended again in 2004. So the amendments to IDEA in 2004 were very sweeping, and increasingly were designed uh, to include children with disabilities as much as possible in the general education system. And it was amended to reflect congressional findings that educational opportunities for children with disabilities can be improved by high achievement expectations. So just because a child has a disability doesn't mean that we shouldn't have high expectations for them, um, and that they should have access to the general education setting, um, so that so that children with disabilities can benefit from socializing and learning with their general education peers. Studies show that it benefits all students to include children with disabilities in the regular education classroom. Um, it's also beneficial to make special education a service rather than a place children go to. Um, the point being here is that children receive the supports they need, regardless of labels. So some students need more support than others, and the children who need the most support uh, uh, go to receive special education services. And the IDEA law of 2004 also provided funds for evidence-based early reading programs, positive behavioral interventions, and early intervening services. So So this meant that prevention was a huge part of, uh, providing services and supports to children. So the more uh, we can help children as soon as they need it, the better off they'll be in the long run. And finally, this new 2004 IDA amendment recognized and responded to the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse school children. Uh, so So in the end, this law is saying that all children, regardless of disability, can be educated, and that they should have access to general education setting, and that we should expect the best from them. And if they need help, they will get that help, and that they won't be relegated to a place called special education. And that special education a is a service for students who need the most support rather than a place they go to. Um, and not only are we taking into account children's disabilities, but also uh, responding to uh, their cultural and linguistic needs as well. So, with all this history, where are we headed in education? So, as inclusiveness in the classroom, regardless of disability, culture, and socioeconomic status, gains greater momentum. It has inspired the LGBT community to fight for their educational rights as well. Um, so, the recent well-known bathroom debate of whether to allow transgender children to use the bathroom of their choice rather than be forced to use the bathroom of their biological sex. Um, this this um, this include children. Doesn't explicitly include children with disabilities, but this movement towards inclusiveness has inspired other marginalized communities to fight for their rights as well and to be included as well. So we're rapidly heading towards personalized education that takes into account students' unique individual situations. So we're beginning to recognize that that no two students are the same, but that they all deserve uh, a free and appropriate education with any supports that they might need. And uh, recent laws have also stressed the importance that all students can learn and lead meaningful, satisfying lives with the right supports that are tailored to their unique needs. So, so the more we go along, the more we're stressing the importance of educating all children, regardless of their unique situations, or regardless of background or their current situations, and that we will work with those students, and that instead of trying to fit them into our mold, we are accommodating their needs instead of trying to have them fit into our perceptions or our curriculum. We're tailoring their education to them rather than what we expect them to do.